So we move to the next presentation, which will be by Alex Klemm, who is Division Chief in Tax Policy in the Fiscal Affairs Department, and he will be speaking about pandemic and progressivity. So Alex, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks very much for the introduction, Ruud. Indeed, I will talk about the impact of the pandemic on attitudes toward progressivity. And let me share my screen. I hope everybody can see the screen. If not, please shout out because I cannot see you. Thanks, Ruud.
It's clear.
Excellent. So let me motivate this work before I dig into it. So when the pandemic started, so I should also mention this is joint work with Paulo Mauro, who is also at the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. So there is a literature that looks at how attitudes of people might be different depending on what they experience. And notably, there have been some papers that look at cohorts of people who grew up during the Great Depression, for example, or some other deep recession or some other important event. And these papers can sometimes show that people who have such experience, they have different views from other people. The pandemic, it's a terrible thing, but it allows us to do research to look at how preferences are shaped. And this is really important because everybody can expect that after the extremely high cost that governments faced in addressing the pandemic, there will be a need to raise taxes or possibly cut spending afterwards when we go back to normal. And that raises the question of how to do it. And there is a strong case to do it in a progressive way because clearly inequality has gone up. And also the costs of the pandemic have been very different across people and across sectors. So for that, it would be interesting to know how people see different potential tax raising reforms. These could include temporary levies, right, where you would just charge this to recover the cost of the pandemic, or permanent structural reforms to raise more revenue. And we also thought it would be really interesting to think about different terms. So should we call it a solidarity levy, or should we call it more specifically COVID-19 recovery contribution, or should such a levy just be called tax like anything else? So this was the motivation for doing this. And with that, let me just jump right into it. We did this by doing a survey, which we undertook in October of last year. So by now I should mention that this was October 2020. This was the ideal time for our purposes because at that time, not everybody had been affected by the pandemic yet. So we could ask people things like, do you know somebody who has become ill from the pandemic? If we ask this now, everybody would know somebody who got ill. But in October 2020, this was still not the case. So we can then distinguish between people who are affected differently. This first slide here is just to show you that our sample is extremely diverse. I mean, I should say it's just the United States. So it's not diverse in terms of countries, but within the United States, it's very diverse. We cover all genders, all income groups, and all regions, ethnicities, education, and so on. And it's also representative of the US population. And this is not by accident, this is on purpose. This is on how the survey was done, ensuring that it fits US Census data. We start the survey with an introductory paragraph. The purpose of that is that we want people to understand why we ask them about tax increases. So rather than appealing to their normal gut feelings about taxes, we tell them the pandemic has been expensive for the public finances. It will most likely require some adjustment later. It could be expenditure cuts, it could be tax increases, but something is likely to happen. And we would like to know their views on what would be kind of the best policy choice. And after this introductory paragraph, which should prime them, we go into the more substantive questions. So the first one is a really simple one. Would you support a temporary levy to cover the cost of COVID-19. And you see here that we use 6 different terms to describe such a temporary levy. But it then turned out that actually the response does not depend very much on how you describe it. So this, let me get my laser pointer. So the COVID-19 recovery contribution term, if we use that, we get higher support. And this is weakly statistically significant, and this survives even in more fancy econometric models where we control for other factors. But you know, if you compare this, the differences are not very large. And my hunch is that this is because we have told people why we introduced this tax. So even if we just call it tax without further description, people already know it is what its purpose is. So then we ask people, assume that such a solidarity tax or temporary levy or whatever you want to call it is introduced. What are the high, or what is the base on which it should be levied? Should it be on high incomes, or should it be on incomes directly related to COVID-19, or maybe on wealth or profits and so on? What I find really interesting about this chart is that first of all, people do understand differences, so they give you different answers for these different things. So it's not just as somebody wants to slap a tax on any indication of richness or wealth or something like that. What I also find interesting is that there seems to be a clear preference for taxing all high incomes, not only those related to COVID-19. So this must reflect that there has been in the background some general unease about high incomes that is not necessarily related to COVID-19. Or maybe the idea that if you do well during COVID-19 times, you should pay this tax irrespective of whether COVID-19 contributed to your high income. Let me go to the next question. This now switches from this idea of a temporary levy to cover a temporary cost to a permanent tax reform. So the first of this type of questions is about support for a permanent progressive tax increase to cover different potential expenditure. And while you see that there are some differences, but generally we get really strong support also for such permanent reforms. And it's especially strong for spending on social spending, education, and so on. The next question is a bit more complicated. As an economist, I would simply say this is a revenue neutral reform. But for the respondents who are not necessarily economists, we explained it more clearly that this is a reform that raises taxes on some, reduces them on others, while keeping our government tax overall the same. Here it's also interesting. People like this idea, especially if you tax the top decile. Here people could choose multiple things, so it's a bit puzzling that the top percentile got less support. It could be because people understood that if you tax only the top percentile, you're not going to raise much, or it could be that they somehow misunderstood the question. Interestingly enough, also people don't support so strongly the idea of taxing multinationals. Then we also asked people about their general attitude about taxes. And here the majority of people think that taxes are too high. So this is quite interesting. While we usually get a strong support of tax increases that are progressive on high income or high wealth, more generally, people think that taxes are too high. So they can distinguish these things. Then we ask how the pandemic has affected people themselves. And we ask about whether they lost employment, whether they knew somebody who lost employment, whether they or somebody in the household got sick. And we clarified in the questionnaire, we mean seriously sick, not sick from a positive test, but without symptoms or something like that. And then whether they might have had no impact. And this is something that we will use later also in the econometric work. Into which I jump now. So far, I have only shown you simple survey results, but clearly there are many things going on and we would like to control for them. So we also undertook a couple of regressions to see what determines support for these taxes. So I don't want to spend too much time on all the control variables. So this shows the support for a temporary levy and how this differs across different types of people. Maybe just to mention one, that more educated people tend to support more strongly a temporary levy. Now, if anybody is interested in any of these findings in more detail, there's also an online appendix where we break this down. And then you can see, for example, that finishing high school is the crucial thing. Any additional education doesn't change so much anymore. And also for the other variables, there's further breakdown for anybody who's interested in it. One thing that I find very interesting is that people who refuse to reveal their ethnicity, they are clearly much more strongly opposed to temporary levies. But let me go to the heart of this, which is the variable suffered. So people who have suffered from the pandemic, and this is defined as either household employment loss or serious sickness in the household. So people who have suffered from the pandemic, they are strongly, significantly more likely to support such a temporary progressive levy. But let's take it one step further, because we would like to distinguish by people of different moral persuasions. And for that, we use the framework by Enke, who showed that, at least across the Western world, you can easily describe political or moral perspective or political preferences based on a few very limited categories. So people usually in most Western societies, they can be distinguished to be either have universalist views. Universalist here means you care about not just you and yourself and your own close community, but you care about the whole country or maybe even about the whole world. Communitarian is the opposite. It would be somebody who cares primarily about their own family or their own community. And to figure this out, we clearly don't ask people, are you universalist or communitarian? Instead, we ask them about their spending preferences. So we ask them things like, would you like spending on healthcare to be increased, to be reduced, or to be left unchanged? And we tell them that among all of these categories, at least one has to be a cut because we want to impose a weak budget constraint on them. And when you do this, you can then tease out these definitions here. So we call a universalist somebody who wants either higher health, education, or climate spending, and who does not want cuts in any of these areas, and somebody who needs to want to cut at least police, military, or border protection spending. The mirror image of that is the communitarian. So I'm not going to go through this. It's the exact mirror image. And then, of course, there are people who don't fit into any of these two categories, which we call moderates. Now, we purposely asked this, and we did not ask them, are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? Even though you could see that these things are somewhat aligned. But we thought that if we ask it like that, people will immediately make in their brains the connection to the positions of these parties, and this will influence their answers, while responding here on some spending questions will not have this effect. And now let's put these assignments of people into the regression. So first, you see the not surprising result here, that universalists are much more likely to support a temporary levy than communitarians. And the comparative group here are the moderates, the ones that don't fit into any category. So we see a clear, significant effect, as I said, not at all surprising. But what really is now the crucial result, the heart of the whole paper, is the interaction of this with being affected by the pandemic. And if we do that, we see that while universalists strongly support such a temporary levy, if they suffer, it doesn't change their opinion very much. So they are in favor of such a measure, but whether their own household suffered doesn't change their attitudes. Communitarians, on the other hand, as I said, their support for a levy is weaker. But if you look at households that have suffered from the pandemic, doesn't matter whether it's sickness or employment loss, they are much more strongly in favor than those who have not suffered. So you can really see here that the experience of the pandemic, the personal experience of the pandemic, increased their support for a progressive tax reform. We then repeat the same analysis also for the more structural reforms, like the tax increase, the progressive tax increase, and the revenue neutral progressive reform. And we find a similar finding. So if you look at the numbers, it's not exactly the same, but it's still the case that support changes more for people who are affected personally by the pandemic if they are communitarian. You now also get a small effect sometimes for the universalists who suffered, but it's still a greater effect for the communitarians. So the result goes through. Now, there are, of course, many things one could ask about this methodology. One would be that our way of teasing out whether somebody is communitarian or universalist is a bit ad hoc. So we also undertook a principal component analysis to let the data speak. And if you do that, you can see that there's a very clear alignment between police cuts, military cuts, and border protection cuts, as well as preferences for increases as well as strong alignment between preference for health cuts, education cuts, local environment cuts, and climate change cuts. So that really shows us that these categories, they are well aligned and they do describe people's characteristics. Infrastructure is kind of less clear, which also is quite intuitive. So we can also use this principal component directly as a measure of being communitarian and put this into the regression, and basically the result survives and shows again that those who look like they are communitarians, they change their views if they have suffered significantly. So they become more in favor of progressive reforms if they have suffered under the pandemic. We do a couple of robustness checks. I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically one of the fear is that people might have difficulty reporting truthfully whether they have been affected by the pandemic. So we relate this self-reported sickness and so on to official data, and it clearly aligns. We can even use official sickness and death rates from municipalities and plug them into the regression, and it still holds. Yeah, we do some more checks, but I guess in the interest of time, it's better for me not to go through those. They are all described in the paper. Let me instead go directly to the conclusion. So we have seen in our survey that there's a strong support for temporary and permanent progressive tax increases. Now, I wouldn't stress too much the headline number because it could be sample selection bias or anything, but the differences are really interesting. So it's also interesting that people support these increases, even though they think their taxes are too high. So people clearly distinguish between a general tax increase and one that affects only high income or wealthy people. We have also found in our analysis that views differ across moral perspectives. And most interestingly, that the change is greatest for people who are initially skeptical about such tax increases when they are affected by the pandemic. We had high hopes of finding major differences across terms, but ultimately it didn't matter very much how we called such levies. And then, of course, we have to acknowledge that there's plenty of open questions for future research. So we don't know how long this observed change in attitudes will last. It will also be hard to figure this out in the future because it will not be so easy anymore to distinguish between people affected and not affected. And we don't know well how these results are transferable to other countries. So I hope that other researchers work on other countries as well and we can compare the findings. And that concludes my presentation. And I hope I can find the button. Yes, I did find the button to stop sharing my screens.
Thank you very much, Alex. No, this is excellent for a very rich and interesting presentation. So I should note that for this presentation, there is no discussant. And actually, I have to thank Alex to step in at the last moment to do this presentation because we had another presentation which was unfortunately dropped because it was not possible to have it today. So thanks a lot, Alex, for this. There is one question in the Q&A that I'm going to read to you, and maybe that kicks off the discussion. And then if people have questions, please put it in the chat or the Q&A, and then we can raise it here for Alex. So the question, Alex, is the point that you also had on your last slide, that most people think that taxes are too high in the US. And the question is, do you interpret this as a result of the long years of shifting the tax burden away from corporations and wealthy people to ordinary households?
Yeah, this is a good question, but not an easy question to answer. I would say yes. I mean, this is one of the potential interpretations that one could come up with. The other is, and I think this is similar maybe to some of the papers we heard about in the morning, that people might not always consider that they get good value for the taxes they pay. So remember that the US is also a country where there is no public health service, for example, and for some of the respondents, they might feel that they have to pay a lot of taxes, sales taxes, for example, which are also very visible in the United States. And this could be driving the perceptions.
Yeah. I'm looking, I see. No, sorry. Maybe I have a question then for you, Alex. So this morning we saw for Rwanda that from Julia's presentation that there were these changes in sort of how people view the government, and they seem to increase their trust in government. And your results also show that people do change their view. So how do you look at this sort of parallel? Do you see this as sort of a general pattern that might have occurred, and how can governments basically, because this morning we also saw this, it might be that if perceptions really change about government, that this could have sustained improvements in sort of support for certain policies. And do we already see that, for instance? Do we see governments increasing progressiveness of taxes? And so maybe you can reflect a bit on the parallels here.
Yeah, thanks. This is also a very good question. So what I think happens is, first and foremost, these questions are more about how people are affected by the pandemic and how they interpret whether being poor or losing income is related to luck or to effort. And I assume that the pandemic clearly showed to many of them quite powerfully that you can suddenly find yourself in difficult circumstances without this being your fault at all. And this is maybe what has changed their attitudes. So what we ask is about attitudes towards tax. We have not looked at attitudes towards public spending, right? So this is mostly about redistribution, although we do find that people like taxes when they are used for public spending. But I think where this leads to is a really interesting point, which is, what do we do with this now? So we have this unique opportunity that people seem to be open to tax increases, both permanent and temporary tax increases. And this is an opportunity to raise more taxes and do more spending. But what will happen if then these revenues are squandered or not properly used, right? Then very quickly, this positive attitude can evaporate. So I see it as an opportunity for governments to do more, but also as a risk. If they don't do a good job in providing good services financed from these taxes, then most likely we will see that people will become incredibly critical again of paying taxes. So I think that would be a nice follow-up actually to see how attitudes change over the next few years towards public spending.
Okay, no, good point. And this relates to a question that was put in the Q&A also, and then I give the floor to Christos for a question. In the Q&A, Mick asks, do you plan a follow-up survey? So this maybe relates to this point. And then Christos, do you want to come in with your question?
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you, Alex, fantastic, very interesting paper, and thank you for stepping in. the last minute. Yeah, I mean, two things. One is I'm not going to go to the sample selection, which is kind of problematic within survey studies. I'm going to put it aside. But one thing, and again, I apologize for that, but I'm not very familiar with the US system and what actually they did during the pandemic and how they assisted in the households. But I guess my question is: are you conditioning on any assistance? The people surveyed have received from the state? If they have, I don't know to what extent this is relevant, but I didn't see anything of that in the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Christos. This is a brilliant question. So one of the main challenges we had in the survey, and anybody who did the survey will find the same thing, is that very often we got comments when we presented the paper that were truly excellent and that made us think, oh, we should have put this question into the survey too. But of course, at that point, you can't do that anymore because the survey has been paid and run and all of this. So with hindsight, I think you raise a really important point. It could be that being a recipient also changes attitudes. Now, one thing to say about the US support and what they did is that I think a lot of that was not linked, no, I think all of that was not linked to being affected by COVID-19. So there have been these tax refunds and these checks to encourage consumption and so on, but they were not linked to whether you had been affected or been sick from COVID. So it's kind of separate, but it's still super interesting. Let me also respond to the question here by Alec. A follow-up survey. I would, of course, love to do a follow-up survey, but anybody interested in doing these surveys, so one of the issues is that they are really expensive. So you need to use a private company and pay them per survey to do that. So it's not always easy to do. We cannot repeat them as often as we would love to, but I would certainly like to do it.
Thank you, Alex. So there's one more question in the Q&A, and that's there's little time to answer, but if you can take 1 minute. So the question is, do you think that the attitudes regarding higher taxes or progressivity are likely to change with the risk of inflationary pressures?
Yeah, I think everything matters, right? And inflation, the good thing is inflation didn't affect our survey at all because it was not on anybody's mind at that time. But as we can see from the other control variables, everything is important. And now from the control variables that we did include, I can tell you that while many of them ended up being significant, none of them really affected the results. So there seems to be, the result we have appears to be quite independent of the control variables. Of course, I cannot guarantee that the same is true, would be true for inflation, but I'm hopeful that it would not affect our result, even if inflation turns out to have an impact. But it would have to have a differential impact on these different moral perspectives across being affected by the pandemic, which hopefully it will not have.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you so much for stepping in and for doing this excellent presentation. Very exciting. So with that, we conclude session 1 at this point.